I'm the reason my brother stayed away from our family for 10 years. Evan's story. My name is Evan, and I'm 28 years old. I have a fraternal twin brother named Den. Growing up, we weren't as close as you might expect twins to be. I've often heard other twins talk about having a deep connection or an inseparable bond from birth, but that wasn't really the case for us. We were more like regular siblings, close enough but not unusually so. At the same time, we didn't dislike each other either. Things were fine during our early years, but by the time we hit the 6th grade, our paths started to diverge. Our interests and friend groups shifted, and it became clear we were heading in completely different directions. I began to get into sports and started hanging out with other athletes. Our group also spent time with the girls in our grade, which was a normal part of growing up. Meanwhile, Den stayed within the same circle of friends he'd always had. They were into superheroes, anime, and hours of video games or board games. Their group was small and mostly made up of guys with just one girl, who didn't really mix with anyone else. By 7th grade, the differences between us became even more pronounced. I experienced a growth spurt and quickly outpaced Den, both physically and socially. By the time we graduated from high school, I was 6'2", weighed 190 pounds, and was in great shape. I could bench press 245 pounds, and my 40-yard dash was clocked at 4.5 seconds, making me one of the fastest guys on the football team. I started varsity as a sophomore, which was a big deal. Den, on the other hand, never had much interest in sports or fitness. He was only 5'8" and maybe 140 pounds by the time we graduated. It felt like we were twins in name only, more like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito in Twins than anything else. Looking back, I now see that I didn't handle our differences well. In middle school, I did a lot of dumb, immature things, and I admit I picked on Den. At the time, it felt like harmless teasing, or the kind of pranks that were normal among boys our age. My friends and I would sometimes call him names or pull stupid stunts like putting something gross in his backpack or messing with his stuff. There was one time we even pulled a prank on a classmate at a party by messing with his shoes. Completely juvenile, I know. Den would get upset, but as a kid, I didn't fully understand why. I thought he was just being overly sensitive. Our parents punished me a few times, and I did apologize on occasion, but nothing stopped me from continuing. By the time we reached high school, we were like strangers living in the same house. Den avoided me as much as he could, and my friends and I only teased him when we wanted to laugh. Then, senior year came along and everything escalated. Den got his first girlfriend, Lisa. They started dating at the beginning of the year and seemed happy together. At the time, I thought Lisa was pretty average looking, but that changed when prom rolled around. Seeing her all dressed up, I realized she was actually quite attractive. I didn't say anything that night, but the next weekend when I was hanging out with my buddies and drinking, one of them, Luke, brought her up. He said, "Hey, you know, Den's girlfriend actually looked fucking hot at prom. I mean, her face is still mid, but her body is so sexy." We all laughed, and Luke took it a step further, joking that I should try to hook up with her. At first I brushed it off as ridiculous, but then Luke threw out a challenge. "I'll give you $100 if you can sleep with her before graduation," he said. It sounded absurd, but something about the challenge stuck in my head. I decided to go for it. I started texting Lisa, keeping it casual and flirty. I played up my confidence, knowing I had more experience with girls than Den did. She was hesitant at first and told me we shouldn't be talking, but she didn't block me. Gradually, she opened up, and I learned that she and Den had already been intimate a couple of times. I used that as leverage, playing on her curiosity and dissatisfaction. Eventually, I convinced her to meet me one evening when I knew Den would be working late. That night, I took Lisa to one of my favorite spots for car hookups. I kept flattering her, telling her how much better I was than Den in every way. She didn't resist much, and we ended up having sex in my car. To prove to Luke and my friends that I'd completed the challenge, I secretly took a Snapchat video during the act. At the time, I thought it was harmless, just a way to secure my $100. I didn't consider the consequences. Afterward, I collected the money from Luke and told him and the rest of the guys what had happened. Then Luke suggested I send the video to Den. For some reason, I thought it was a good idea. I sent the video and waited for a reaction. None came that night. The next morning, I woke up to a flood of angry messages from my mom. Den had shown her the video, packed his things, and left the house. He told my parents he was tired of my behavior and blamed them for never holding me accountable. My mom and dad were devastated, but I didn't feel much guilt at the time. I told myself I'd done Den a favor by exposing the truth about Lisa. Den left and never looked back. Over the years, we've learned bits and pieces about his life through mutual acquaintances. He joined the military, moved to Washington State, and hasn't spoken to any of us since. My parents have tried reaching out countless times, but he never responds. Now, a decade later, I regret what I did. I've told a few people about the situation, and they all say I should apologize. But how can I do that when Den won't even talk to us? I don't know if there's any way to fix this. Part of me wonders if it's too late. I finally managed to get through to my brother Den. After so many years of silence, I decided to make one last effort to reach out. At first, I tried to approach it calmly, sending him a couple of messages where I apologized for everything that had happened between us. I tried to be the bigger person, the nice guy, hoping that would get him to open up. But after 10 years of being ignored, 10 years of him cutting off not just me but our parents too, I hit my breaking point. I was done walking on eggshells. In my frustration, I sent him a much more direct message. I didn't hold back. I told him exactly how I felt about the way he'd treated us over the past decade. Sure, I made mistakes when we were kids, but to completely cut off his family for 10 years over what, in my view, was dumb stuff that happened when we were barely old enough to understand the consequences of our actions, it felt like overkill. I let him know everything he'd missed. Every Christmas, every Thanksgiving, we had celebrated them all without him. I told him he didn't even know what he'd been missing, like my perfectly deep-fried turkey that everyone looks forward to. It wasn't just about the food, of course, but about the memories we could have made together. And the whole time, not a single call, email, or text from him. Nothing. I called him out for being an asshole, for not realizing that we were kids back then. I told him that at some point you got to let things go. Family is supposed to stick together, I said. We're supposed to forgive each other, to find ways to move forward. I reminded him that the right thing to do would have been to try to work things out instead of running away. I didn't sugarcoat it. I needed him to know how much his absence had hurt. To my surprise, what I said actually got through to him. He messaged me back. For the first time in 10 years, I heard from my brother. He admitted that I was right about some things. He said he regretted how things had turned out and apologized for the way he'd handled the situation. I apologized too, owning up to the hurtful things I'd done in the past. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it felt like a weight was lifted off my chest. It was amazing to reconnect with Den after so much time. It felt like we were finally starting to bridge the gap that had grown between us. Wanting to show him that I meant what I said about moving forward, I offered him a spot as a groomsman in my wedding. It felt like the perfect way to bring him back into the fold, to show him that he was still part of the family. He didn't say yes right away though. He told me he'd think about it and let me know. I can't blame him for needing some time to process everything. After all, 10 years is a long time to hold on to pain and resentment. But just hearing him say he'd consider it meant the world to me. For the first time in a decade, I feel like we're on the path to being a family again. And that feels better than anything else. Update. I got married last weekend, but honestly, it feels like it might have been the worst decision of my life. Looking back, I probably should have called the whole thing off. What was supposed to be a beautiful day turned into an absolute disaster. And the worst part, it wasn't just some small hiccup, it was a full-blown train wreck. We had planned for it to be an incredible wedding. The venue was gorgeous, the decorations were perfect, and we didn't cut corners on the food. The highlight of the menu was shrimp as the main course. Do you know how expensive shrimp is? It's like $14 a pound. The food was about the only thing that went right that day. Everything else spiraled out of control. I really thought things were going smoothly. My brother Den had come into town a couple of days before the wedding, and it was nice to catch up with him after so many years. But in hindsight, I should have been upfront with him about something pretty important. I was marrying his ex-girlfriend from high school, Lisa. It's not like we'd been dating this whole time or anything. We only reconnected last year, and it wasn't even planned. Lisa came into the enterprise where I work because her car had been totaled in a rear-end collision. She was sitting at a red light in front of the BP station on the east side of town when a teenager who wasn't paying attention slammed into her. Thankfully, she was okay, just a little whiplash, but her car was a total loss. Insurance set her up with a rental for a week, and that's how we started talking again. She mentioned she had just ended an engagement, which made things easy for us when we got serious. She even still had the deposit down on a venue. All she had to do was change the date, just in case we decided to tie the knot. Smart thinking on her part, I guess. Fast forward to the wedding weekend. Lisa and I agreed that traditional bachelor and bachelorette parties would be fun. Mine was on Friday night, the day before the wedding. I invited Den and he told me he'd be there, but he didn't show up. It bugged me, but I shrugged it off. I still had a good time with my friends, downing 17 bush lights and laughing until my sides hurt. Then came the day of the wedding. Everything seemed fine until it wasn't. The ceremony was scheduled for 3 p.m. and at around 2:30, I got a Snapchat message from Den. It was a video of him and Lisa in the backseat of a car. I don't need to spell out what was happening in that video. The caption read, "Repaying the favor." I was in complete shock. The video was set to play once and disappear, so I couldn't even watch it again to make sure my eyes weren't deceiving me. And as if that wasn't bad enough, my buddy Luke came running over a few minutes later holding his phone. He'd gotten a snap from Den too, only this one wasn't as graphic. It was just a picture of Den and Lisa in the back seat, looking disheveled. From the way they looked, it was obvious what had just happened. Apparently, Den had sent this to multiple guests at the wedding. That was the tipping point. All hell broke loose. Guests started arguing. My parents and Lisa's parents were horrified. Lisa and I had a massive fight right there, just minutes before we were supposed to walk down the aisle. I was so angry, I was ready to call the whole thing off and walk out, but then she dropped a bombshell. She told me she was pregnant. I didn't know what to do. My head was spinning. I talked to my parents, Lisa's parents, and Luke. They all told me that the right thing to do for the baby was to go through with the wedding. So, against every instinct I had at that moment, I did it. I stood there in front of everyone, said my vows, and put on a smile that couldn't have looked more fake. The mood was ruined though. No one was happy. It felt more like a funeral than a wedding. Now, I can't stop thinking about what Den did. I just can't believe my own brother would pull something like this. One of my friends had the nerve to compare it to what I did to him years ago with Lisa. But that's not the same thing at all. Back then, she was just his girlfriend. This time, I was about to marry her. It's not even close to the same level of betrayal. Lisa and I are trying to figure things out. She took a pregnancy test right in front of me to prove she wasn't lying, and it came back positive, so here we are, trying to navigate this mess. As for Den, I'm done with him. He's no longer my brother in my eyes. After what he did, I've decided I'll never speak to him again. Some things are unforgivable, and this is one of them. Den's story. 10 years ago, my brother Evan did something unforgivable. He went out of his way to get my girlfriend Lisa to cheat on me with him. To be honest, I'd already been planning to cut ties with Evan even before that incident. Our relationship had always been toxic, and my parents weren't much better. My original plan was to maintain a distant, low-contact relationship with them. But that plan fell apart completely the morning after Evan's betrayal. Lisa and I had been together since the first week of our senior year in high school. Back then, I had a lot of anxiety when it came to talking to girls. I just didn't know how to approach them or hold a conversation without second-guessing myself. My group of friends wasn't much help in that department either. We were all awkward around girls, except for one. She was the only girl in our group, but she had been dating another friend for years. To the rest of us, she was just one of the guys. When I found out Lisa liked me, I didn't know how to respond at first. It was unexpected and left me completely clueless, but after some hesitation, I decided to go for it. I started messaging her on Snapchat, trying to keep the conversations light and fun. To my surprise, it worked, and within a week, we were officially boyfriend and girlfriend. That senior year turned out to be one of the best times of my life. Lisa and I went to all the dances together. She was in the school band, so I even started attending football and basketball games, something I'd always avoided. Evan was always playing on the field, and I couldn't stand being around him. Still, seeing Lisa perform made it worth enduring his presence. When prom came around, I was over the moon. By then, Lisa and I had already exchanged I love yous, but we hadn't taken things further yet. Prom night changed that. Lisa wasn't a virgin. She had been in a secret relationship with another guy in the band for 2 years before we started dating. But I was. Her past didn't bother me much. She came from a strict religious family, and according to her parents' rules, she wasn't even allowed to date until she turned 18. To them, I was her first boyfriend. On prom night, Lisa and I became even closer, and for the next 2 weeks, we couldn't get enough of each other. But then, things started to change. About a week after prom, I noticed Lisa becoming distant. She seemed distracted whenever we spent time together, and our conversations grew shorter and less frequent. I was panicking, convinced she was going to break up with me. One night, after work, I came home and hopped online to play World of Warcraft with a few friends. I was trying to distract myself from the growing tension in our relationship when I got a Snapchat from Evan. It was a 4-second video of him having sex with Lisa. Her face wasn't visible in the video, but I knew it was her. The caption read, "I win again." That moment shattered me. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed up crying, feeling completely betrayed and humiliated. The next morning, my mom noticed something was off and asked me what was wrong. Against my better judgment, I told her everything. Deep down, I hoped this would be the moment my parents finally stood up to Evan and held him accountable for the years of torment he had put me through. But my hope was misplaced. My mom admitted that what Evan did was wrong, but then said something that completely broke me. "You should be thanking him for exposing that little slut." I snapped. I had endured years of Evan's bullying, and my parents had never done anything about it. Since middle school, he and his friends had made it their mission to humiliate me. They spread rumors, called me gay den, and planted explicit images in my locker and backpack, all designed to embarrass me. Freshman year, they even circulated a photo of a micropenis claiming it was mine. My parents always brushed off his behavior, handing out half-hearted punishments that never lasted. That morning, I realized nothing would ever change. My parents would continue enabling Evan, and he would keep getting away with everything. So I decided I was done. I packed a few bags, loaded them into my car, which I had bought with my own money, and left. Unlike Evan, I hadn't accepted my parents' offer to buy me a car because I didn't want them holding it over me. That decision paid off that day. Lisa tried messaging me, but I blocked her immediately and never spoke to her again. I didn't even attend my high school graduation ceremony. Instead, I moved in with my friend Luke, who had graduated early and found a job in the next town over. I stayed with him for a few weeks until my National Guard training began. I hadn't told my parents I'd enlisted. Soon, I was shipped off to Georgia for 10 weeks of basic training, followed by air traffic control training in Alabama. The National Guard gave me the structure and discipline I needed to rebuild my life. My service ended 2 years ago, and now I work as an air traffic controller in Seattle. Over the years, my parents have tried to reach out, but I've ignored every attempt. I block every new number or account they use to contact me. Recently, Evan has started trying to get in touch as well. I don't know what they want, maybe money, maybe reconciliation, but I'm not interested. That chapter of my life is over, and I have no intention of reopening it. They're part of a past I've worked hard to leave behind, and that's where they'll stay. Update. For the past couple of years, my brother Evan has been sending me random emails every few months. They always come at the most bizarre times, usually around 3 in the morning. I have no idea what motivates him to do this, but it's become one of his odd patterns. These emails are in addition to the occasional messages I get from my parents. Those typically show up whenever there's a family event, like a wedding or some kind of reunion. I'm fairly certain my absence at these gatherings has disrupted the illusion that we're a close-knit family. Sometimes I wonder if they still make excuses for me not being there, trying to explain away my absence without admitting the truth. I've made it a rule to ignore and block any calls, emails, or DMs they send my way. That applies to Evan too. However, I do tend to read his messages before I block him again, mostly out of curiosity. I like to see if I can figure out what he's really after. With my parents, it's always obvious. They want to maintain appearances. Evan, on the other hand, is so clueless and inconsistent that it's hard to tell what he's trying to achieve. His emails are a strange mix of half-baked apologies and rambling updates about his life. One time he sent me an email that must have been at least 500 words long, all about his job working at the desk of an enterprise rent-a-car. Don't get me wrong, I'm not shaming anyone's job, but the details he included were so unnecessary. He went on and on about the most mundane things like the importance of recording mileage. If he'd shared funny stories about crazy customers, that might have been interesting. But no, it was just an endless monologue about the day-to-day operations of a local rental car branch. Other times, he writes about his hobbies, like fishing trips or his opinions on the Grizzlies' upcoming season. Once, he sent me a detailed email about a hunting rifle he'd bought. He described every single feature of the gun, down to the smallest detail. I couldn't tell if he was trying to impress me or intimidate me. Most of his emails are like that, long-winded, pointless, and entirely missing the mark. And yet, at no point in any of them have I read anything that sounded like a genuine apology. After 2 years of this nonsense, it seems Evan finally got fed up. I'll admit, I was surprised it took him that long. About a week ago, he sent me another email, this time talking about his fiancée. That was the first I'd even heard about him dating anyone since I left. He gave me the rundown on her, clearly expecting some kind of response from me. Of course, I didn't reply. 3 days later, when it became clear I wasn't going to, he lost it. The next email he sent was a full-blown rant. For how ridiculous it was, it still managed to piss me off. In the email he wrote, "You are such an asshole. I can't believe after all this time, you're still butthurt about the actions of a dumb kid. We were kids. It's what kids do. They give each other a hard time. I didn't mean any of it, and it's not like you actually got hurt. Nobody beat you up or anything, and I still got punished every time you snitched on me, so it's not like I got away with it. I don't hold that against you. I forgave you for that. And about Lisa, I did you a favor. She wasn't ready for a relationship, and I saved you from wasting your time. You need to grow up. If not for me, then for mom and dad. You've torn this family apart. That's not what families do. Families look out for each other and forgive each other." That email sent me over the edge. I was furious. He genuinely believes that what happened was no big deal and that I'm as much to blame for our fractured relationship as he is, maybe even more so. He downplays everything he did, dismissing it as harmless childhood antics. He'll never understand the impact his actions had on me unless I make him understand. So I decided to respond to his email. I apologized, and he did too. We talked for a while, though most of the conversation was him rambling on about his life over the past decade. Apparently, his adult years have mostly consisted of getting drunk in the woods. He has an uncanny ability to recall exactly how much he drank and what kind of alcohol it was, even if the event took place years ago. Talking to him felt like I was speaking to an alcoholic Rain Man. And now, somehow, I've agreed to be a groomsman at his wedding, which is happening in 3 weeks. It will be the first time I've seen Evan or my parents since just before our high school graduation. I wasn't planning on reconnecting with them, but they couldn't leave me alone. Now I'll take this opportunity to show them exactly what it was like to be me. They'll never forget it. Update: I arrived at my brother Evan's house late Thursday night, just a couple of days before his wedding. The wedding itself was scheduled for Saturday, but I had decided to come early to set my plan in motion. I already knew the bride was Lisa, my high school girlfriend. It wasn't exactly a secret. Their wedding announcement and all the details had been plastered across their public social media profiles. Still, I acted surprised when the topic came up, playing the part of the clueless, long-lost brother. Lisa had changed so much since high school. Back then, she was the quiet, unassuming girl who blended into the background, almost invisible. But somewhere in her early 20s, it was like she'd done a complete 180. Now, her social media was a mix of overly confident rants about what makes a real man, usually paired with selfies in sports bras. It was hard to believe she was the same girl I'd once been in love with. Seeing Evan for the first time in a decade filled me with a strange sense of satisfaction, not for any sentimental reason, but because of how much he'd let himself go. In high school, he'd been the star athlete, always in peak physical shape. Now he had a full-on beer gut, soft arms, and zero definition in his shoulders. Meanwhile, I had turned things around since then. I was no longer the skinny, scrawny kid who avoided confrontation. The roles had reversed completely. and I couldn't help but enjoy that. As I glanced around his house, my attention caught on some photos of kids hanging on the walls. Curious, I asked Evan about them. That's when I found out Lisa had 2 kids from 2 previous relationships. For a moment, I almost reconsidered my plan. If what I was about to do would ruin a chance for those kids to have a stable home life, maybe I should back off. But then Evan clarified. Lisa didn't even have custody of her kids. They both lived full-time with their fathers, and Lisa only saw them sporadically, maybe every few weeks. That was all I needed to hear. Evan tried to apologize for taking things too far sometimes back in high school. I knew he didn't mean it, but I played along, offering a fake apology of my own for cutting him and the rest of the family off for 10 years. I didn't mean a word of it. This was all part of the act. If I wanted them to understand the pain they'd caused me, I needed to make them feel like everything was fine. Until it wasn't. Spending that night with Evan was a challenge. He spent hours regaling me with the same tired stories, most of which were variations of the same theme. Him drinking with his 2 or 3 close buddies while watching sports or fishing. Occasionally, he'd mix in a camping story, but even those were just thinly disguised chronicles of the types of alcohol he consumed. I'll admit, I was slightly impressed by his ability to recall exactly what he drank on a random Friday in March of 2019. It was like talking to an alcoholic Rain Man. I survived the night and braced myself for the bachelor party, or rather, the bachelorette party, the following evening. I had no intention of going to Evan's party. My plan was always to crash Lisa's. The night with Evan had been about gathering information, and I'd learned all I needed to know about their plans. Lisa and her small group of friends were at a local club. When I showed up, it didn't take long for her to notice me. Naturally, she came over to talk. I steered the conversation toward our time together in high school, letting her reminisce. She apologized for how things ended and threw in some nonsense about missing those days. Eventually, she let slip a small complaint about Evan, and that was my opening. I pulled out an old phone I'd kept from high school, something I'd held onto specifically for a moment like this. On it were the texts Evan had sent me back then, filled with insults about Lisa. He'd called her a dog face, an anorexic whorebag, and his favorite term, the thing. As Lisa read the messages, her face crumbled. I asked if she wanted to talk somewhere more private, and she agreed. We went out to her car, and it didn't take much to push things further. A casual comment about what bachelorette parties were really for was all it took. Within minutes, she was pulling off her dress. Before I left, she made one final request, not to tell Evan about what had happened. She was pregnant, she said, and didn't want to lose another father for her child. I had gotten everything I needed. I agreed to keep her secret, then left and returned to my hotel. I showered and got a few hours of sleep before waking up early to catch a flight back to Seattle. By 12:30 p.m. my time, I sent the messages I'd prepared. All the incriminating evidence, texts, photos, and details went straight to Evan and my parents. I know chaos erupted because their responses came almost immediately. Both Evan and my parents sent furious messages declaring that I was dead to them. That was fine by me. They'd been dead to me for the past 10 years anyway. I could only imagine the humiliation my parents felt as their perfect family image shattered. Their dirty laundry was now out in the open for everyone to see. I don't feel an ounce of guilt. If anything, my only regret is not being there in person to witness the fallout. They brought this on themselves. I made it clear I wanted nothing to do with them, but they refused to leave me alone. Now, maybe they'll finally understand and stay out of my life for good.